that should be enough. Okay, I'm here with Caleb Maupin, and we decided to have another chat. So, was there something specifically you wanted to talk about?
Well, we had talked about a couple of things we might want to get into. You'd listed a couple topics, but let's just have a conversation, right? I mean, a lot of people want to hear what we have to say, so why not give them something to listen to?
Okay, no, I want this one because it was one of those things where I didn't think it was going to be a big a deal as it was. The anti-white politics.
Ah,
Now, I thought it was. I mean, I made it pretty simple. Saying kill white people doesn't make white people want to join you. That's simple. I mean, that's not complicated. It's not a terribly complex theory or anything like that. I'm not saying there's no such thing as racism or anything like that. It's just very simple that if you turn white people away, they're going to go somewhere else. They're going to turn to Trump. And I think that was like the main thing that was the crux of the last election. Both sides expressed concern over working class issues. The people who voted Republican were lamenting the loss of the middle class. They wanted to return to the Norman Rockwell painting 50s, whatever. And the people on the Democrat side were like, loss of health care, education, essentially both different views of the same kind of working class problems. But then Hillary, I mean, let's face it, Hillary's just a warmongering shill, but what she did was she played into the ID poll. She played into the anti-white politics, and that pushed people right away directly into the hands of Trump.
well, yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. The thing is, I'm hesitant to talk about quote unquote anti-white or anything being quote unquote anti-white because, I mean, let's be real, okay? I'm white, and people making jokes, people having these kind of feelings, even people putting kill white people on social media doesn't really hurt me in any way. I'm not going to not have a job because people make jokes like that.
No, I agree.
I'm not going to, right. And I'm sure you do. And I'm not trying to lecture you. I just want to make clear that, compared to what people of color actually endure, this kind of hipster, anti-white, I don't know, some people use terms like SJW. It doesn't really, it's not like a form of oppression. You know what I'm saying? It's not something that's making just, people use terms like reverse racism. I don't buy into any of that, At the same time, though, I do think you're right in that it's just silliness. And what's weird, I should say what's the silliest about it is almost all the time when I hear this, it's not coming from people of color. It's like white people themselves making jokes at the expense of white people because they think that makes them somehow look like hip and cool and anti-racist or something.
That's definitely true.
And it's like, it's like, okay, look at you, you know what I mean? And it's just like, it also reminds me of one time I remember when I was first getting involved in left-wing politics. A website went up on the web called Stuff White People Like. And what this activist group I was in, somebody sent it out and they're like, oh, this is the funniest website I've ever seen. And I remember I looked at this thing and I thought, like, what white people is this? Like, because, I grew up in a town that was almost entirely white. I graduated in a high school class that was almost entirely white, but none of the stuff on there, like, it was listing, like, coffee shops. There were no coffee shops in my hometown. Activist certain brands of clothing that I didn't wear, no one had ever heard of. And I thought, this was supposed to be stuff white people like. I'm white, I'm from Ohio, but I was not included in white people. And when I looked at the list over and over again, one thing was like black political prisoners. Like no one in my hometown liked black political prisoners. They were all Republicans, But the more I looked at it, it was referring to like urban middle class white people, which are different
hipsters.
Politically. Yeah. Different politically, different economic status, different worldview, and then often I'll hear statements. Now that I live in New York City, I've lived in New York City for the last 5 or 6 years. I'll hear statements about quote unquote white people that just aren't true. For example, I've heard people of color say, for example, white people don't believe in God or white people aren't religious. Well, the white people that I grew up around were certainly religious. But
yeah,
urban.
I don't know where they're getting that from.
Yeah, but urban middle-class whites tend to not be very religious and tend to be quite secular. I've also heard white people don't own guns. Well, among the Trump voters, you can bet there's a lot of white people who own guns.
Yeah, that's a good one there. White people don't own guns, yeah.
And
I think
that
white people own the most of them.
yeah, and that when it gets down to it, this goes to show that all these, right-wing reactionary racists who are talking about quote unquote white nationalism are complete fools, because the idea that there is a white nation is ridiculous. I mean, I'll never forget when I was in Detroit, and in Detroit, in the center of Detroit, there's a little like area called Hamtramck, and it's all people from Poland, right? It's a Polish neighborhood, right? And
Yeah.
I was in a restaurant in Hamtramck, and I remembered I was in the restaurant, owned by a Polish family, barely spoke any English. I was there in the restaurant, and I remember I saw on the menu in Hamtramck, Detroit, this Polish neighborhood, on the menu it said no refills on soda. So the waitress came, she brought me my soda, my Diet Coke or whatever, and she says to me like, and I said to her, I pointed to the thing, I said, it's too bad you don't have any refills. And she said, oh, we do for you. And I thought, what does that mean? And then she kind of motioned over to the black people that were sitting in the restaurant. And I thought that was bizarre, because she was basically saying, we don't give refills to people of color. She was being racist. But then I thought about her. She barely spoke English. She was Roman Catholic, an immigrant from Poland. We don't even speak the same language. We don't, we had nothing in common, but yet she was basically giving me white privilege, if you know what I'm saying. Like, we were both, she was considering me to be white.
Yeah.
I was white, she was white, and she was discriminating against people of color. So whiteness in the USA is just kind of the state of not being black, or the not being brown, or not being Asian. It's not a nation. It's not a nationality. It's not a culture. There is no white American culture. There is no white American nationality, right? You've got so many different people in the United States, so many different backgrounds, different worldviews, different languages, different dialects, all kinds of different things that are considered to be white in the United States. White is just kind of a negative. It means you're not a dark-skinned person. You're not a person of color.
Yeah, I found a lot of that to be true too. For example, I grew up in the second most racially diverse city in Canada. So this whole, white people were a minority for the longest time. Like, I've always lived in a very multicultural place. So the whole idea didn't really seem to make sense to me. Like, there were the things that just, like, I had always had friends that were brown-skinned Muslims, and I never thought anything of that.
Right. And that's, it's just very, I mean, this kind of, it's starting to, because of global capitalism, people from all over the world are coming to live in the same countries. Overall, it's a lot of different cultures and traditions are kind of fading away as we're all on the same Facebook and all on the same social media. And that, we're kind of getting a new global culture created by capitalism, and it has a lot of problems. And I wouldn't say, it's like you get these like far right types that'll be like, oh, the white American culture is being eroded. No, I'd say every culture is being eroded. Traditional African culture is being eroded. The traditions of people in Eastern Europe are being eroded. All the kind of, rich histories of culture are being eroded. They're replacing all the traditional music around the world with like Miley Cyrus, and that this kind of commercialized, cheap, make a buck over Facebook and social media and iTunes culture that comes out of, of capitalist, imperialist, big corporations is kind of taking over and eroding every culture. And I think that's the conversation people need to have, not like my culture is being eroded by this culture. And there was a time, I think, like, for example, there was a time where like Christianity was being forced on people in developing countries where they had different religious traditions. And that was clearly wrong. But now we're in a period where it's like all kinds of cultures are being eroded to make room for this new global, liberal, cosmopolitan, commercialized, buy stuff and go out and dance and drink alcohol culture that's really, really cheap, and I don't think this isn't one culture being under attack. This is almost all cultures being under attack. Does that make sense?
No, yeah, I do understand. That's, capitalism, in a manner of speaking, when it comes to things like that, doesn't discriminate. It's going to take everything. If you have something that's popular, it's going to take it over. Like, we could just point to hip-hop before it became corporatized and compare it to the way it is now. I mean, that one's also a very obvious point.
Sure, and that's why all these people who want to make, I will say, these elements in the USA, that is a big thing among a lot of low-income white workers. There is this appeal to them, like, oh, you're oppressed because you're white, preserve whiteness. I mean, that kind of politics is growing with Richard Spencer and all that kind of stuff, but that stuff is garbage. I mean, it's just based on a complete illusion. I mean, it really is. And it's just like, and like, you can't get those people to even define what white even means. If you press them, they can't even give you a definition of what a white person is. And at the end of the day, it's just a political expression of their prejudice and bigotry and fear of people that are different from them. And it's a response to the alienation of capitalism, right? That they're frustrated about the opioid crisis. They're frustrated about the increasing amount of, of crime. They're frustrated about the drop in wages, and that is affecting all kinds of people in the United States of all kinds of different backgrounds. And they interpret it as somehow an attack on them for being white, and that's absurd. People of color have been dealing with these horrendous things for much longer.
Yeah, when wages go down for working class people, that's going to get everybody from all kinds of racial demographics. I mean, the minimum wage, while it is skewed towards people of color, I mean, there's certainly no lack of white people on minimum wage.
Sure. I mean, and that's the thing, is that, the good paying industrial jobs, and I mean, it's true, that these good paying industrial jobs that Trump talks about, black people were largely excluded from them in many parts of the country. I mean, it was like, Detroit was Motor City, but they didn't start hiring African Americans en masse until the 1970s, after there'd been, this huge explosion and urban rebellions and stuff. So finally, the automakers discovered that they could hire African Americans. They said, oh, we just couldn't, we just didn't have the capacity to do it, or something like that. I mean, and that I mean, this whole thing that economics is the most important thing. I mean, Marxism, historical materialism, it's about economics. It's an economic theory. It's not a theory about, everything just being fair and everyone being nice and sensitive to everybody else and not saying naughty words. It's a theory about economics. And when you take the economics away, you just get this confusion. So it's like, I mean, there's this whole thing on the internet about quote unquote cultural Marxism. If you press these people, they don't even know what they're talking about. They can't even really explain it. And they've never read any Marx, because, if you read Marx, he's talking about economics and how economics then impacts things like the family structure, things like the way nations develop, and that, yes, all those things, but the root is an economic question. How do the means of production function? What is the mode of production?
No, that's the main thing that's missing from a lot of leftist debate today, is they're just completely ignoring that. And then I'm sure you've been hit with this accusation, so have I, that as soon as you bring that up, hey, there's a systemic thing here, this is how the system functions, so this is what it does, then they turn around and say, well, you're an economic reductionist. And, well, what do you think Marxism is? It's a theory, or class reduction. It's like, Marxism is a theory of class struggle. Like, what are you talking about?
Right. And that's the thing, is it's like, it's one thing if you were to tell people, like, we're African American, we're fighting racism, stop fighting racism, only fight capitalism, only talk about class issues. But I don't think you or I have ever said that. It'd be a different thing if we were to go to women and say, stop struggling against sexism, stop fighting patriarchy, just focus on the class. Like, no one's saying that. But we're saying that the roots of this oppression comes from class society. And it comes from the fact that the means of production are operated to make profits, and that society functions and replicates those relations, and the relations of society function in accordance with the mode of production and the way that things are carried out. And that oddly, a lot of the folks that are going around, and especially like quote unquote postmodernism, it really obscures that. It's like it takes some of the cultural stuff that came out of Marxism in the 30s and 20s. It kind of takes that, and then it strips the Marxism from it, right? And it's like, and then and then it's like there is no truth. Everything's just a matter of competing narratives. The solution isn't struggle. It's just we got to listen to each other and have more narratives and sit around and have kind of group therapy. And it's kind of a weird thing, but this is a synthetic creation. This is, as after the fall of the Soviet Union and after the loss of Marxist ideology being so prominent in the world, a synthetic left has emerged that gets funded by big foundations and kind of pushes this stuff that we hear on the campuses, this oppression theory that you might call it, which, I mean, it's not that it doesn't point to true things. It's not that it doesn't point to real problems, but it's not Marxism. It's just not Marxism. The right wing calls it Marxism, and the left wing, they don't call it Marxism, but it doesn't give them tools with which to counter the existing problems of the status quo. When you see millions of low-income white workers who are angry, you can't go to them and say the problem is capitalism. If all you've ever read is Judith Butler and these other people, you're going to say to them, how dare you think you're entitled to high wages? Look how people of color have had it. You need to listen to them and be humble. Like, No one wants to hear that. The last thing anybody wants to hear, and I will say this is just my experience, the last thing anybody wants to hear is you've had it too good. Nobody ever wants to hear that. If you go to somebody and say, your life is too good, and I want to make your life worse, very few people are going to listen to you. Very few people have any interest in hearing what you have to say. And the reality is, and you may disagree with me here, but the reality is that socialism would be to the benefit of all working class people. It would be to the benefit of all who sell their labor power to survive. Obviously it would be more beneficial to those who have it the worst off. But in
I don't disagree
ultimate,
with that.
Okay, good, great. But yeah, that's my take on that, and that's why your video. I don't disagree with what you said, that this quote unquote anti-white thing that these hipsters are doing, and they got jokes about spicy food and all that. It's like, come on, this is just this isn't politics. This is just silly hipsterism, and it's off-putting to a lot of people that are really suffering, who are working class and happen to be white. They take it as a personal attack. Whereas if you're a more privileged middle class hipster kind of person who's not really suffering, you could be like, oh yeah, I have what. But people, it's a gap. There's a gap culturally, and I think that people just don't get it. One thing I will say that is interesting is that I've seen a lot of people that are on the right wing. They hear the phrase "kill white people" in places that it's not there. You know what I'm saying? It's very bizarre. Like Trump tweeting out that there was killing of white farmers in South Africa when they're not killing anybody. It's simply the economic redistribution. There's no one's been killed. And then there's, I've heard, right-wing people say, oh, at all those Black Lives Matter rallies, they chant kill white people. They don't chant kill white people. It's just not a fact. But it's kind of like, the mind of people that are opposed to black liberation. It's somehow they hear the phrase kill white people in all these places where it ain't there.
No, that's definitely true. It's not the way that they're necessarily portraying it, and it becomes very frustrating watching so much dishonesty on both sides. When I said, this making fun of people doesn't actually accomplish anything. It's dumb. It's reactionary. Why don't you actually engage with the ideas and then turn around and then insult me again? Like what?
Sure.
Yeah, I'm saying engage with the idea. Please do it. Debate over this. Discuss ideas. And then they just turn around and throw names at me. And they're like, you're probably the kind of white person that claps when the plane lands.
Oh, boy. Oh, boy. It's just, it's I don't know. I feel like there are, unfortunately, a lot of people who are drawn to Marxism, but it's an expression of their social isolation. It's kind of like they really are angry at the society they live in. And so it's kind of a way for them to express opposition to it. We're told that this is a capitalist society. We're told that communism is the most evil thing. So they're like, oh, okay, well, I hate the society I live in, so I guess I love communism. And they sit on the internet and they just kind of rage against the society that they live in. And that's their politics, And I feel like for them, and a lot of them, they do, and particularly they'll target people like you and I, or anybody who actually seems to be trying to accomplish anything in the world. It's like we somehow are like ruining it. Marxism is just their way of kind of expressing how mad they are at the world and how isolated they feel. And guys like you and I that are actually trying to spread these ideas and convince people to think in a certain way, we're kind of an argument against their state of being. And so they lash out at you and I, and they're really not worth paying attention to. A lot of these people are just, they're people that have, a lot of difficulty in their life, and I sympathize with them. As hard as that can be when they send you hateful messages and stuff, I sympathize with them. I really do, because if they're that angry about me, I'm making YouTube videos. I'm not, you know what I'm saying? If they're that angry at people like you and I, there's something else going on there.
Yeah, definitely. You've always said if you think you can do it better, do it. If you think you can make better videos than both of us, then by all means, step up.
Please, yeah. And I'm not. I think that would be great, But there you go. But what else is on your mind? There was a lot more we were going to talk about than just spicy food jokes.
I was actually. You know what? I know very little about what's going on in South Africa. Like, I'm going to admit that that's an area that I don't really have a lot of knowledge of. Could you give me a rundown of that?
Sure. Well, the African National Congress That was, that was a coalition, but it was led by the South African Communist Party. And they engaged in armed struggle. They received support from the Soviet Union. There was another group called the Pan-African Congress, which received support from China. And they were more of a nationalist-oriented group. The African National Congress, the ANC, was a more Marxist kind of oriented group. And they were fighting against apartheid. And ultimately, apartheid came down. But it came down, the apartheid government in South Africa came down around the same time that the Soviet Union collapsed. So at the time that the African National Congress came to power and became, and they are the ruling party in South Africa, at the time that they came to power, there was a fear that, the Soviet Union had just collapsed. The global forces of resistance to U.S. imperialism around the world were weak. And there was a fear that if they did try to, nationalize everything and create a socialist planned economy, they would immediately have a civil war, and that the USA would go in and fight them, and there was no Soviet Union to come to their aid. And so, they didn't touch economic relations. In a lot of ways, they didn't touch property relations. They didn't nationalize things. They didn't redistribute the land. And the economics of South Africa is very much the economics of what was there before. The legal system has changed, though. There is not legal apartheid. There is not legal discrimination. The government is overwhelmingly black now, but the property relations stayed intact. And the understanding was that eventually they would move toward changing property relations. And there was some feeling, there's a new party that was formed, the Economic Freedom Party. And that's a political party that, people that were around the African National Congress that felt like it wasn't doing enough to move the country towards socialism. And now there is talk of actually, redistributing land from the white farmers who've owned it for the last 200 years after seizing it in colonialism, the Boers. And there's talk now of redistributing the land so that the African people who live there can have control of the land. That debate and that process is now taking place in South Africa. David Duke, the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, is of course very outraged about it. He's been meeting with the Boers and telling them how oppressed they are for being white. And some of the far right, I mean, when this happened in Zimbabwe, you'll remember Zimbabwe used to be Rhodesia, named after Cecil Rhodes, the British colonialist. And when, Rhodesia was facing an uprising, a revolutionary, people's war led by Robert Mugabe and the Zimbabwe African National Union that was supported by the Soviet Union and China, when that was going on, you saw a lot of white racists from all over Europe going to Rhodesia to fight for Rhodesia. And in fact, the man who shot Martin Luther King, James Earl Ray, was actually a member of the Friends of Rhodesia, from what I understand. And he was a big supporter of Rhodesia, and that white supremacists saw the white farmers of Rhodesia as their allies. And that we're seeing now that there's talk of, moving toward redistributing the land. The other thing is that there has been, since the fall of apartheid in South Africa, there's been a thing called farm raids. And the farm raids are basically, it's not the government doing it, but, local communities, they'll become angry, and they'll go attack a white farm and steal a bunch of stuff. It's kind of mob action. And that actually, as economic opportunities increase, what they call these farm raids that have been very violent have been decreasing as economic opportunities increase. It tends to be when conditions are bad, when people are poor, they feel a resentment about the white farmers that have been there and have been the colonizers and are doing much better economically. That they'll be kind of vigilante. Black Africans will go and raid these farms. But that has decreased in South Africa. And part of the reason they want to have a legal government-led land redistribution is to put a stop to that kind of thing. They don't want people to just be going out and attacking white farmers randomly. That's not civilized behavior. They want to have a formal redistribution of land by the government, which is something that is not just done in communist countries. I mean, there was land redistribution all over Latin America, in a lot of the U.S.-backed countries. That countries from the colonized world tend to have a problem with all the land being owned by a small minority. And that's something throughout the 1960s and 70s. A lot of pro-U.S. governments, like the Shah of Iran, for example, like some of the dictatorships in like Venezuela and throughout Central America, that was one of the things they were doing, was redistributing land and just making the land ownership more equitable among the population.
Well, that seems like a fairly reasonable understanding of what has been going on. There's nothing terribly, tremendously evil. There's no, white genocide being carried out. Do those who claim that there's a white genocide carrying out, do they tend to post any numbers or anything, like statistics?
I really haven't followed the people who make that argument. I will say that the most expert conversation I had on this was when I was in Russia, and I was at the Yalta Economic Forum in Crimea, and I spoke on a panel of youth. And on the panel of youth that spoke with me was a youth leader of the African National Congress. And so I had the opportunity to speak with him afterwards and to interview him. And in our conversation, I asked him about the land redistribution. And his argument was, he said, look, our people, we lived here and our land was seized. We became a colony, and we don't own the land of our country. And that after, the overthrow of apartheid, we never addressed this issue. And it's come time that we need to address this issue. And that was his argument. And, it's a bad situation. And, on the one hand, you can imagine how some, white South African might feel, right? They might be like, look, I built this farm. This is, my grandfather built this and I was here. My father built it and I was here. I didn't take it from the Africans. I've just lived here. I've just been living my life. And now the government's going to come along. And I mean, you can understand why there'd be some resentment there. But at the end of the day, the injustice that was done to the African people is far, far, far more than the injustice that they're experiencing. Now, some people are making a civil rights argument and saying, well, this is, you're depriving citizens of property on the basis of race, and that violates UN laws and all of that. Now, that's an argument that's being made, and it may end up in an international body. It's a controversial issue, but ultimately it's trying to resolve the question of colonialism, and that's what it's trying to resolve. And in Zimbabwe, immediately after they started doing the land redistribution in Zimbabwe, immediately after they did that, there was economic problems because there was some chaos, right? Because it's like people are abandoning their farms. But actually, after about a decade, actually farm productivity in Zimbabwe started to actually increase afterwards. And that the problems come during the process of redistribution. But once it's finished, then things tend to be more productive once again.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this points to a bigger question, though. All right, because it's very easy for us. We sit there and we're reading a lot of books about Marxism to go, oh, if we were there the second after the revolution, we would have redistributed everything and we would have fixed it all. But you have to, I was talking to some people from Zimbabwe, right? When I was in Russia at the World Festival of Youth and Students, and I was talking to some Zimbabwean communists and the Zimbabwe African National Union. And I was talking to them, and Zimbabwe is a very, 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 there's very low level of economic development there, right? Not many factories, not much industry, so ZANU comes to power after the revolution, right? They have a treaty with the treaty that's signed, the Lancaster House Agreement says they won't touch property relations for 10 years. So what do, right? You seize control of a very, very, very poor country. You have a treaty that basically the British won't attack you as long as you don't touch property relations for 10 years. What do? Well, they took huge measures to wipe out illiteracy, right? So that's one thing that Zimbabwe did, right? Then after 10 years, around 2004, long after 10 years, they did start redistributing the land. There was massive land redistribution. They've nationalized the diamond mines, but it's still a very poor country. So one thing that they've just done, and they were very excited about this when I spoke to the people from Zimbabwe, is that they have actually set up, I think it's the world's largest waterfall is in Zimbabwe, Victoria Falls, right?
Yeah.
The world's largest waterfall, one of the natural wonders of the world. But it's way far away from any city. It's very hard to get to, but all kinds of tourists go to Zimbabwe to see it. So China has financed the construction of a hotel, a tourist hotel near the falls, and the people in Zimbabwe are really excited about it because that means jobs, that means tourists will be able to come there, that means they're very excited about it, They've also nationalized the diamond mines. So now the diamond mines of Zimbabwe, the profits from it aren't going to Western corporations, it's going to the people of Zimbabwe. So they're doing the best they can. But again, it's not like you seized control of a country that already had the level of wealth that the USA and Canada and France and Germany have. You're seizing control of a country that's very, very poor and underdeveloped because of colonialism and imperialism. So then it's not like the day the revolution happens, you don't just get to start over. People bring with them all the baggage that they've had, all the problems of poverty. They're all still there. But the question is, how do you make a better country once you seize control? And that's a question, and that it's much it's much harder than it looks, and it's not like, you just take over and you just, can will it, and keep on top of that. Then at the time the African National Congress took power in South Africa. I mean, up until the last minute, the U.S. government was calling them terrorists. They were on the foreign terror list. They were designated as a terrorist organization.
Oh,
yeah. I mean, the Soviet Union came to their aid and did a lot to support the people, the people of South Africa struggling against apartheid. But the U.S. government, thought the apartheid government of South Africa was a good ally against communism, and if they were to take power and start, trying to immediately nationalize everything and redistribute land, and then there was no Soviet Union to back them up, no one to come to their aid and protect them, they could really be in a bad situation. It's that politics is not as simple as people think it is.
No, I mean, you don't have a revolution in these cases because everything's going swimmingly well and everybody's happy and satisfied. I mean, of course, you're starting from the bottom and people are rebelling because of the way things are, because of how messed up they are, because of how backward and undeveloped they are. And that's been a constant theme throughout revolutions in history, because they were being mismanaged or because they were being exploited, that people rose up and attacked those who were oppressing them, and then turn around the next day and say, oh, look how poor the country is. Well, you didn't really have a problem with how poor the country was when it was under colonial domination, but now all of a sudden, now that the colonizers are gone, that you're concerned about how poor it is? I mean, that's absolutely ridiculous.
Sure. I mean, the Soviet Union, prior to the Russian Revolution, was a totally agrarian society. I mean, mass illiteracy, 70% illiteracy, barely any electricity outside of the urban areas, barely any running water. And when the Soviet government launched the 5-year plans in 1928, and they started building up the country, I mean, they, in just a few short years, in 5 or 6 years, they became a world industrial superpower. In 1936, the Soviet Union was producing more steel than any other country on Earth, right? They had electrified the whole country, running water all throughout the country, literacy, they'd wiped out illiteracy, they were building universities, they were, they had the biggest power plant in the entire world, the Dnieper Dam, located in Ukraine. What Stalin achieved with the 5-year economic plans, where he basically transformed Russia from being a medieval level of development economy into being a country that was like exceeding the United States in steel output and electricity and all kinds of other levels, that's unprecedented. That's not happened before. And that's why, if you look back in the 1930s, people from all across the political spectrum were just in awe of what the Soviet Union was doing. You had people from all over the world going there, electrical engineers, scientists, just trying to figure out how are they doing this? I mean, what are they doing? And, all kinds of and not communists, but wealthy people, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, two kind of liberal social democrats from wealthy backgrounds in Britain, and all kinds of, social scientists, and all of them were just in awe of what the Soviet Union was doing in the 1930s, and that Roosevelt, he based his Works Progress Administration in the USA that built a lot of the infrastructure of the USA by studying what Stalin did with the 5-year plans. Even Hitler and Mussolini tried to study what Stalin was doing, because it was like no one had ever done that before. Like how rapidly they had economic growth because they didn't have capitalism, because they had a planned economy. And that all kinds of people, I mean, you can read Time magazine articles from that time where they're marveling about how rapidly the Soviet Union is growing. You can read articles from the New York Times, articles from the mainstream press where they're not pro-Soviet at all. They're just how are they having this level of economic growth? Something's happening here that we've never seen before.
Especially considering that the growth of the Soviet Union was happening at the time when the world was buried in the Great Depression, while the rest of the world is facing the terrible collapse and everything is being destroyed, and millions of people are dying in the U.S. from starvation, and then the Soviet Union is just saying, well, whatever, man, and then turn it into a superpower in 10 years.
Right, and they end up hiring some of the most smart people from the Western countries, like the Koch brothers. That's an oil family, and a wealthy right-wing oil banking family in the USA. The Koch brothers. Well, their father, Fred Koch, he wouldn't be anybody if it wasn't for the Soviet Union. He was a chemist, and he invented a new way of turning oil into gasoline, thermal cracking, right? So all the oil companies in the USA tried to put him out of business because he copyrighted his idea, patented it. He wasn't going to let some company take it. So they all sued him, tried to put him out of business. So he went to the Soviet Union, and Stalin started using his methods, using Fred Koch's methods, to run the Soviet oil fields in Azerbaijan and other parts of the country. And that was, I mean, for Fred Koch, the father of the Koch brothers, who were like raving right-wing anti-communist libertarians, their father became who he was, became a billionaire, and ultimately, became his methods and scientific methods and his breakthroughs in oil were all put into use because of the Soviet Union. And it was like some of the best art in the world. Sergei Eisenstein, who's like one of the most famous filmmakers of the 1920s and 30s, right? He's the guy who made the battleship Potemkin. They call him the father of the montage. He invented the montage. He was in the Soviet Union. They were making some of the most advanced movies in the world. Shostakovich, this is a composer who was like the top classical composer from that time. He was in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was just achieving all of this miraculous stuff, and that's why the Communist Party of the United States was such a big organization at that time. That's why communist groups all over the world were so big, and it was because communism was so powerful. That's why fascism ultimately emerged. It was a response to the strength of communism.
Yeah, and also I learned this from somebody else. The idea of transitions in a movie, that was invented by the Soviets.
Oh, was it Sergei Eisenstein?
I don't remember the name, but I know it was the Soviet. So it probably was him.
Yeah, and you can watch Eisenstein's movies. I mean, Battleship Potemkin, which was his movie, was a movie about a group of sailors who are, they have bad conditions on their ship, so they rise up against the captain of the ship, seize control of the ship, right? It's like an hour long. It's like a silent movie from like 1924, like right after the Russian Revolution. And the Soviet Union sent this movie like all over the world to show to people. And people had never seen anything like this. People would like break down into tears and start sobbing. And they just had this explosive reaction to it. It was like one of the most powerful movies emotionally that had ever been made at that time. There's a famous scene from it where there's like a baby carriage rolling down a staircase. It's like very famous, and it's like the mother's been shot by the Tsar's military, and so the baby carriage is rolling down the staircase, and like people would just be like on edge, and like people would see that movie, and they were just filled with, it was really, in terms of art, it was one of the best things that had come out. I mean, they say today, if you want to understand how to make movies, you have to watch the Battleship Potemkin by Sergei Eisenstein.
That was him?
That was him. Yeah.
The baby stroller going down the stairs, like that's like a cliche now, but that was him?
That was him, and that was a Soviet film. And interestingly, Goebbels, the Nazi propagandist, he saw that movie and was like on the edge of his seat, and he was just blown away at how effective it was in spreading the Bolshevik message. And apparently that inspired him to make Nazi propaganda, because he was just blown away, at the power of that film. And that a lot of the fascist stuff was a response to the power of communism that was coming out of the Soviet Union. But yeah, the baby rolling down the carriage, very famous, yeah.
Oh, confirmed. Propaganda was created by Stalin. Stalin's responsible for the Nazis. Confirmed.
Oh, well, that's not the point, but
oh no, yeah, I know.
Right. Well, what's interesting is that the fascists, a lot of the I'm not talking about the ideas or the practice, but a lot of the aesthetics that they adopted was actually just a distortion of what the communists had already done. The Nazis wore their armbands, their red armbands with the swastika on it. Well, the communists had already been wearing red armbands. They had parades. The communists have their salute, the fist salute that comes out of the Paris Commune. So the Nazis adopted their salute, and that these were methods that it wasn't even really communism, but German social democracy and the Social Democratic Party of Germany, Karl Kautsky had developed. He had developed these methods of just kind of making propaganda to spread political ideas. And so as the Nazis were trying to build their own movement to defeat communism, they adopted a lot of the methods that had been developed by German social democracy. And that's just, it was because they were effective. Like one thing you'll notice from that time period, Hitler had a very distinctive mustache. Well, Stalin also had a very distinctive mustache, and Lenin was bald and had this very distinctive goatee. And the idea was you couldn't really print very, very detailed propaganda posters back then, right? So if if there's a face with a goatee on it, that's Lenin and it's bald, right? If there's, a guy with a handlebar mustache, that's Stalin. It was a way to so having the leader have a very distinctive facial hair was a way to make them very recognizable on posters. That's what that was about. And so, of course, the Nazis adopted it. Hitler had his like token mustache. This was propaganda stuff. And a lot of these folks who try to say, oh, communism and fascism are just the same thing. Well, they use similar aesthetics because those aesthetics are effective when you're trying to build a mass movement. But it's a mass movement for a totally different purpose. That's the point. One is a mass movement to completely change society, get rid of oppression, and eradicate poverty and build a whole new world. And the other is a movement to try and restore the good old days by killing people and beating people down and tearing them down. They couldn't be further apart from each other. But however, because they use similar aesthetics, because they're trying to build a mass movement in order to do it, in liberal modern culture, there's a kind of a cliche of equating them.
Yeah, it's like they use that one on North Korea sometimes. Because there's like some vague similarity to something that happened in Imperial Japan. Oh, here's the guy riding on a white horse. So here's the Emperor of Japan riding on a white horse. Therefore, same thing. That's absurd. That would be like saying that Malcolm X is the same as David Duke, and they clearly are not the same. Anyone who understands anything about the history of the United States and race relations knows that Malcolm X, he may have made statements to the effect of, I love my race, I'm fighting for black people, but that's in no way the same thing as David Duke making statements to that effect. That these relations are different, and then when people want to equate those things, they just don't understand the history. They're not understanding the context. No, of course, they're two completely different things, and that gets... It goes the same thing with Venezuela. Venezuela being poor for decades and decades under right-wing imperialist rule, and nobody has anything to say. You don't go, well, look at what capitalism did. They're just like not even paying attention. But somebody comes along and puts their foot in the imperialist ass and says it's time to change things and make things better. Then all of a sudden everybody goes crazy.
Well, and where was the mainstream media on Venezuela's economy before 2013? Their economy was doing astoundingly well prior to 2013. Eradicating poverty, eradicating illiteracy, building new hospitals, building new schools. I walked through neighborhoods in Caracas where every single house had been paid for by an interest-free loan from the government. And prior to that, people had lived in shacks, without electricity or running water. They were doing a lot of, when the oil prices were high, right? We're talking back before the oil price drop of 2014, when the oil prices were very high and the government, budget based on oil was very high.
Just a coincidence, though.
Yeah, the U.S. media just didn't notice that. It's like, but then when the economy got bad, all of a sudden, it's been bad ever since Hugo Chavez took power. Well, that's not the case. And actually, there's a Wall Street Journal article where the reporter says, I went to Venezuela in 2013 and the party was still on. The government was building infrastructure like crazy. All kinds of new luxury hotels were being built. But then the media just kind of forgot to report on that, But now that things are bad, socialism did it, right? It's just silliness. And then Haiti, meanwhile, is having huge economic problems in Haiti, right? Haiti, their economy is just crashing and burning. People are out on strike. Wages are down. People are actually eating dirt.
Yep,
right?
It's like pear.
Yeah. But no one ever says, "Oh, that's because of capitalism." Well, no, that's just the way. No one ever says that's because of capitalism, right? And then you get this. Well, it's not real capitalism. It's not real capitalism. When is it real capitalism?
When you have that completely abstract notion of it that doesn't exist in real life.
Well, right, and that's the whole thing. Is it's like, the USA is wealthy because of capitalism. But then if you point to any of the problems of capitalism in the USA, well, it's not real capitalism. So are we rich because of not real capitalism? Well, no. It's like there's no consistent definition of socialism and capitalism from these, these Charlie Kirk types, these, Dinesh D'Souza libertarians. It's like it's capitalist if it's good, if it's working, and it's communist or socialist if it's bad and we don't like it. That's all there is to it. They're not consistent at all.
I've noticed they do that to China too. Whenever China does something bad, it's socialist, and then China does something that they like, then it's all of a sudden China's capitalist.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. If I ever debated one of those guys, the first question out of my mouth would be, give me a clear definition of what is capitalism and what is socialism, and then we can have this debate. Because until they do that, I've had them say the USA has been socialist since 1935. Well, if the USA has been socialist since 1935, I guess the boom of the 1950s, the Cold War years, was all because of socialism, right? Oh, no. Right? They can't. They just go back and forth. It's just, If it's good, it's capitalist. If it's bad, it's socialist. That's all they know. China is successful because it's socialist. Bangladesh is poor because it's capitalist. Or they say it the other way around. I mean, it's just, if you can't. These people, they pander to what everyone thinks they knows, and that's the problem. Is that people get fed these cliches. Communism always fails. Communism never achieved anything. They get fed these cliches in school, and these guys, they just go around pandering to the cliches. And the only people who debate them are liberals. And these liberals don't, they believe in capitalism, right? They just believe in, kind of a more adjusted capitalism. So they agree with them ideologically. They just don't agree with their tactics. They believe, well, we should have regulations. We should have a minimum wage. They don't buy into the idea we should just completely privatize everything. But ideologically, liberals are in the same place. They believe in capitalism. But
if we only regulate it, then I think that's the big thing about capitalism, whether liberal or conservative. For a conservative, any time that something goes wrong in capitalism, it's always the fault of some external force. But when something goes wrong in capitalism, the liberal always blames an internal force. Like, well, if we didn't have this one crooked guy who was doing these things, then everything would be okay. But the conservatives, so if we didn't have this guy outside capitalism interfering, like the Zionists or the globalists, then everything would be okay. In either case, it demonstrates that both of them are incapable of actually critically looking at how a system works.
Oh, absolutely. And the funny thing is, in so many ways, these libertarian types are every stereotype that they play up about us, they do, right? I mean, right? They always say that, oh, it's not real socialism is our response to everything. Well, no, I'll defend socialism where it exists. But meanwhile, their response to everything is that that's not real capitalism. They say, well, we need another Pinochet, right? They don't care how many people have to die in order to carry out their, capitalism as utopian agenda, right?
Yeah, it's not like he was a fascist or anything.
Right. I mean, these people are like, they fulfill every stereotype, every cliche about communists, that we're true believers, that it's always not real socialism, that we don't care how many people have to die to carry out our evil, ruthless agenda, that we have groupthink, that we're they fulfill every stereotype about us. Meanwhile, we're guys who can just read. We read economics textbooks, my goodness, look at Russia's economy, the fall of the Soviet Union, right? According to their argument, when they were privatizing everything and just letting Western banks come in there, it should have been paradise, right? It should have just been a great time. And everybody in Russia will tell you that was like the worst time in their lives. I mean, they lost roughly 10% of their population, either people fleeing the country for economic reasons or because they just couldn't live. I mean, massive heroin deaths, massive suicide rates, sex trafficking, in big number. I mean, the 1990s, when they had Boris Yeltsin administering free market capitalism in coordination with Bill Clinton and the neoliberal economist Jeffrey Sachs from the IMF, I mean, it was a nightmare in Russia. But according to these libertarians, it was supposed to be paradise, right? It should have been like, finally, they got growth, except they didn't, right? And that the economy of Russia started getting better when they nationalized, when they asserted government control over oil and natural gas with Putin. He fixed up the economy. That's why he's so popular over there, is because he put an end to the free market madness of the 1990s. This whole narrative goes against everything Adam Smith and Milton Friedman and all of them have ever said. I mean, it's not the facts, I mean, but they look at that and whatever. I mean, it's like, it just seems very obvious. If you look at Russia's history, their economy got stronger under socialism, it collapsed under capitalism, and then it got better when they reasserted state control. I mean, but that's a fact they'll never acknowledge, right? I mean,
the same thing with a bloody Chile. When they came in and put a Pinochet into power, everything collapsed. And then when they started to turn things around after they renationalized copper, etc., then the bloody Chicago school turned around and said, oh, it's an economic miracle. No, it's because you did the opposite of what you claimed would work, you dork.
No, I mean, Milton Friedman, I mean, that guy, I mean, he's a hack. And like every government that he's ever advised, he has economically ruined. He was in the Nixon White House. He was working for Richard Nixon, and he was advising Richard Nixon. And he completely, wrecked the U.S. economy. They had a big economic downturn. And then Richard Nixon kicked him out of the White House and said, we're all Keynesians now, right? He went to Israel, and he was advising the government of Menachem Begin. Very similar situation, wrecked Israel's economy. And then all of a sudden, Israel kicked him out and started, moving and reasserting state control. I mean, Chile, right? I mean, he came in there, they wrecked the place, mass unemployment, mass childhood malnutrition. I mean, the economy, I mean, at that point, you had like the average family in Chile was spending like 75% of their income on food, right? I mean, when he came in there and he got rid of all the food subsidies, he denationalized everything. He just destroyed the kind of the industrial middle class that made Chile what it was. And when he came in there and just wrecked the place, it was a disaster. And like you said, things got better in like 1982 when they'd already kicked Milton Friedman out of there. And so it's like this notion that this is a brilliant economist. This is who we should all be studying. I mean, it's absurd. I mean, they gave him a mini series on PBS, and it's very funny. In his mini series on PBS, they had Ronald Reagan on there introducing him, and Ronald Reagan introduces him, and he says, "This is Milton Friedman, the man who won the Nobel Peace Prize for economics." There's no Nobel Peace Prize. Exactly. There's a Nobel Prize for economics, not a Nobel Peace Prize for economics. Reagan had no idea what he was talking about. So, I mean, he's the man who won the Nobel Peace Prize for economics. You got to listen to this guy. I mean, it just shows you how, I mean, the whole thing is a joke. And, he made these documentaries that they were showing on American TV, free to choose, and he was pushing privatize everything. It'll just make the economy better. And a lot of people bought it. I mean, they really did. And the world has been buying it. And now, though, Bolivarianism in Latin America is very much a response to it. And I would say, actually, I would disagree with you a little bit, Jason. Okay. When you say that the discussion of socialism in the USA, it's not. I mean, I wouldn't disagree with you that yes, they're not really talking about socialism, and you're right, they're not, right? But I think it's significant because basically what has happened is for the last few decades, the discourse in the USA has gone like this: we can't have a minimum wage. That's socialism. We can't give people health care and education because that's socialism. We can't, just have basic social welfare programs in the USA because that's socialism. We have to privatize our schools because having public schools is socialism. That's the conversation that's been going on in the USA for the last 3 decades. So you've got millennials coming along that have been bombarded with this their whole lives, and they've come along and they've said, you know what? If getting a free education is socialism, fine, I'm a socialist. They come along, they say, look, if getting to be able to see a doctor when I'm sick makes me a socialist, fine, I'm a socialist. I mean, if wanting the minimum wage to be livable so people can, survive and have a low wage job, fine, I'm a socialist. And that's kind of, it's like the little boy who cried wolf, is that neoliberal economists have been bombarding everyone with you can't do that, that's socialism, that's communism, and the stigma has worn off. And yes, these millennials, they don't really advocate socialism. That's the problem, is they advocate a European welfare state. They advocate things that most countries in the world that are capitalist have, But it's blowback to the neoliberal extremism of the 1990s, where they were basically, the capitalists of the world were just in this like go for the kill, the whole world belongs to us because the Soviet Union fell mode, and that's been eroded. I mean, it's like the little boy who cried communism.
Well, I mean, I guess you do have a point there.
Yeah.
I would just like to see some nice anti-war stuff.
Yeah, me too. I mean, and Bernie Sanders' record is not good on those kind of issues, and I will say that absolutely. And I find it disturbing that that actually the most anti-war sentiments come from the right. I mean, I don't want to say too much about the death of John McCain, but I'll say this: John McCain died, and I saw all these people that purport to be socialists and leftists saying things to the effect of, John McCain was the last sane voice in the Republican Party. Oh no, the sane Republicans are dead, and now it's those crazy Trump ones. I'd prefer the Trump Republicans over McCain any day. Trump, Trump is not a professional warmonger. Trump took power on a platform of saying he would end the wars. He didn't, obviously. He's not fulfilling his promises, but that's the campaign platform he took power on.
I didn't really think he was going to do it.
Yeah, but I just don't understand how these people that purport to be anti-imperialist or anti-war and all of that can be saying that they're sad that John McCain is dead because he's a sane Republican. What is sane about John McCain's foreign policy stuff? I don't think there was anything sane about it.
Do you mind if I say something about it?
Yeah, go. Say whatever you want.
Okay,
freedom of speech on YouTube until they shut you down.
Yeah, I just didn't want to say anything that might be blamed on you kind of thing.
Sure, yeah. Well, you say what you say, and I say what I say.
The following opinion is expressly that of Jason Unruh and not necessarily of Caleb Maupin or a reflection on the policies of RT. So I'll just say this. Dude, he deserved to die. He was a piece of garbage. He was a horrible human being. Like, listening to them talk about how he was a peacemaker, like, what the hell are you talking about, a peacemaker? The guy basically advocated genocide in multiple freaking countries. This guy was always pushing for war. I mean, he basically is like the founding father of the bloody white helmets that are going around chopping heads. Like, oh my God, this guy constantly advocated war. Like, he's like Bolton Jr. And then, but he's gotten so much cred because he used to be, because he fought in the Vietnam War. So therefore, what he says has more credibility. I'm like, God, no, he was basically a genocidal monster. And then, like, to have them standing there and saying that he was like this, it's like this good guy who wanted what was best for America. And I listened to the speech at his funeral where, I don't know, some guy from the military, I can't remember his name, was saying how John McCain had a good eye for American interests. And I'm like, please define what that is for me, because I would love the public to hear that.
Well, I think if you look at the coverage on mainstream TV surrounding the death of John McCain, if John McCain hadn't hated Donald Trump, it wouldn't be the way it is right now. The fact that Donald Trump and John McCain didn't like each other is what's prompting this response. I mean, you get situations that are just bizarre where it's like, John McCain explicitly said he did not want Donald Trump to come to his funeral, right? He said he was uninvited, not invited. And then you have people getting on Twitter, how dare Donald Trump not go to John McCain's funeral? And it's like, he wasn't invited. Like,
he was disinvited.
Right? Like, the whole situation around it, it's just like, I mean, it's just, you said a lot of things that make a lot of sense, but, I don't get into, I will say, I just don't get into, when people celebrate, the death of somebody. I mean, I guess like World War II, right? Like when Hitler died, right? And it's like the German Nazis had been defeated and Berlin was being liberated by the Soviets and Hitler was in his bunker and he shot himself. When that announcement came that Hitler was dead, yeah, the whole world was celebrating, right? Because it was like a victory. But this is an old guy, like, got a brain hemorrhage, got brain cancer. Like, there's nothing, this isn't some huge victory or something. This is just, so it's like when I see people on the internet, jumping up and down gleefully, I'm just kind of like, really? Come on. You don't look good when you talk that way. That's kind of my feeling. I just, it just doesn't sit well with me. When I see people reacting that way to it's the death of an old man. It's an old man that, in my opinion, did a lot of bad things, but it's just like, it's not like this was some, it's not like this was like the vanquishing of some great foe. This is just, an old man died. And at the time of his death, he was very, very, very powerful. So if you're somebody who doesn't like John McCain, just thinking, oh, he finally died at the age of like what? He was like in his 80s, I think.
81.
81, yeah. So, it's like, oh, okay, so he died. Well, most people die by the time they're 81. It's just, it was going to happen sometime. Like, I just don't get people, and I feel like, there are people out there who are, confused about all these things. And if they see leftists jumping up and down about somebody the media is telling them was a good man, they're going to react negatively because they don't get it. And I don't know. I don't know. I don't like to participate in that kind of thing. And, but I'm not, people can say what they want to say. People can express themselves.
Well, you and I both have very different styles. I think that's pretty obvious.
Yeah. Right. Yes, absolutely. But there was a couple other things you wanted to talk about. I can only be on for a little while longer. I'm going to have to run in a little bit, but I've got a little bit more time here. So,
how much time you got?
I can probably do another 15 minutes.
Okay. What's something else? Damn.
Well,
now I want to go back to Facebook and look at what stuff I said.
Oh, okay. Well, you'd wanted to ask me a little bit about Vietnam, I think, right? And if you see this situation where like there was a coup attempt recently in Vietnam.
Yes. That's what I wanted. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Do that.
Right. There's this thing in Vietnam, the Provisional National Government, which is a pro-U.S. group that basically sees itself as the legitimate government of Vietnam. They have newspapers and offices in Japan, and they're basically trying to overthrow the government, right, of Vietnam. They've been caught, they've been sentenced to, years in prison. And it kind of highlights the whole situation because it's like right now the USA has kind of a touchy relationship with Vietnam. it's like, on the one hand, the USA is trying to court Vietnam as an ally against China, right? And there's talk, Vietnam's going to host U.S. battleships. There was even some talk of U.S. bases in Vietnam, but that didn't happen. That was like overruled. And so Vietnam, they have this resentment against China. There's some disputed islands. So on the one hand, the USA is trying to court Vietnam, but then at the same time, these people that are tied to the USA, funded by the USA, are working to overthrow the government of Vietnam. We've got the Trump administration speaking in favor of these people that were trying to engage in terrorist attacks. That's what they were convicted of doing, was trying to get weapons and engage in terrorist violence for the purpose of overthrowing the government of Vietnam. So it's like this relationship is very, very weird. The USA is kind of encircling and focusing on going after China, but they also just don't want the Communist Party of Vietnam to be in charge anymore.
Well, it doesn't really go great for them. They would love to have just like a complete, straight up compliant, imperialist puppet government set in. But then again, you can't push them too hard, or they're gonna lash back at you.
Yeah, when I went to both the World Festival of Youth and Students, the one in 2013 in Quito, Ecuador, and the one in Sochi, Russia, in October. And I both times I met with the Ho Chi Minh Communist Youth Union, which is like the Young Communist League. It's the Communist Party's youth group in Vietnam. What I thought was interesting is both times they said that we are not a socialist society in Vietnam. Actually, that they said we are not a socialist society, but we would like to become one. And they said, look, we have not reached the level of development that we're a socialist. We have, a communist party in power. We've wiped out illiteracy. We provide free healthcare to everyone under the age of 5. But they said we're just not at the level of development to be a socialist country. And there was actually a document written by a leader of the Communist Party of Vietnam that was published in Cuba, and it was circulated throughout the internet. And it's very interesting because it gets into kind of how the Vietnamese Communist Party sees things and how they see themselves. And they view Cuba as a socialist country. They view China as a socialist country. They view North Korea as a socialist country. But they say that they are not yet a socialist country. And I thought that was very interesting.
Well, they're still in a period of development.
Yeah, I mean, that's what they argue, and that that a socialist economy means that you have major state-run industries, you have huge levels of production going on, controlled by society.
That sounds fair enough.
Yeah. No. The other thing, though, I wanted to comment on was like Brzezinski, right? So he died. Zbigniew Brzezinski.
Oh yeah,
right?
I know him.
Well, that's an interesting case study, because anyone who's a serious leftist these days should know about Brzezinski. Because Brzezinski, this was a Polish guy, right? Polish citizen who had basically worked with the CIA to foment anti-communist revolts in Poland after the Second World War, up into the 50s and 60s. Ended up moving up in U.S. politics, eventually became national security advisor to the Carter administration. He also worked in the Reagan White House. But if you look at the main thing that Brzezinski did, he was one of the key architects of the color revolutions, of manipulating leftists to carry out U.S. imperialist goals, right? I mean, his big crowning achievement was Afghanistan, where he convinced the world, convinced all these leftists that this was the Soviet Union's Vietnam, and that Osama bin Laden and al-Zarqawi and all these really reactionary Wahhabi extremists from Saudi Arabia were Che Guevara's up in the mountains fighting for the freedom of the Afghan people against the evil Soviets, right? And it was a PR war. And it's crazy. CBS News actually got caught airing battle footage for the war in Afghanistan. This was documented by the Columbia School of Journalism. They published this and exposed them. Airing battle footage from the war in Afghanistan in the 80s that was staged. It wasn't real battle footage. It was people in costumes running around pretending they were mujahideen, right? I mean, that's how much he was a PR man. And basically coming out of the 60s with the anti-war movement and the protests against the Vietnam War, Brzezinski went into the White House and went into the halls of power in the USA and figured out how to sell war to leftists, how to make U.S. imperialist operations, regime change schemes, funding extremists to topple governments, to carry out U.S. foreign policy goals, how to make it look like it was a slick people's revolution from below. I mean, that's basically what he figured out to do. And that's Zbigniew Brzezinski's big contribution, is he was the PR man. He was a PR guy for U.S. imperialism, mainly targeting leftists. And that in all the socialist countries, you had this strata of young people, right? Of people that were like the children of like the party higher-ups, right? In like Czechoslovakia, Romania, Poland. And they were in a position of relative privilege in the socialist countries. And that a lot of those young people they wanted total capitalism, right? Like maybe they had a bigger house than everybody else, maybe they had nicer cars than everybody else, but they wanted to be able to just shop at Walmart and listen to Beatles music, and they wanted total capitalism, basically. And Brzezinski figured out how to kind of manipulate the children of the party elite. And that in the late 80s, as all the socialist governments of Eastern Europe were falling, they called them the students who were protesting. A lot of them were the most privileged people in these countries. The working class, the factory workers, were the ones who generally supported the Communist Party. It was these children of the elite who had a kind of a privileged life at the hands of the party elite, who were enamored with the West. They loved rock and roll music. They loved Coca-Cola, and they were convinced that if they brought down the Communist Party, they didn't understand that everyone wouldn't be able to keep their guaranteed job, everyone wouldn't be able to keep their guaranteed health care, that all of that would be swept away. They thought they would be able to keep all the economic benefits, plus they'd be able to shop at Walmart. And that's just not what happened. And there was an illusion, and that it was the most elite, privileged people that were involved in these color revolutions to bring down the governments throughout Eastern Europe. And Brzezinski was involved in it. He was also involved in the Afghan stuff. It's kind of fascinating. I mean, Brzezinski, it was manipulating this kind of middle-class leftism to serve imperialism. That was the main thing that he did, with staging the Afghan war, with the color revolutions, with organizing these kind of protests and revolts throughout Eastern Europe. And to be fair, I mean, these societies were, stifling. I mean, let's be real. I mean, they didn't have the level of freedom of speech that we have in the West, but they couldn't, because they were fighting for their lives against, in the Cold War, against U.S. imperialism. I mean, it was a state of war. They were facing sanctions and blockades, and it was a highly authoritarian, militarized situation. And that they basically, Wall Street and American capitalism and the Pentagon was able to kind of convince people that all American capitalism meant was, McDonald's, Burger King, and boob jobs. That, and that they didn't understand that American capitalism has this other side to it, and they didn't understand, the benefits that they enjoyed from their socialist system would be stripped away, and that was kind of, it was, that the Cold War from the United States, it wasn't won in terms of military victory. The Soviets were very effective militarily. It was very much a PR victory for imperialism. And I think one of the things that really stands out, I think that's kind of iconic, is, in 1989, you had the Tiananmen Square incident, right?
Yeah.
Well, that picture that comes out from Tiananmen Square is you have like a lone marcher, and he's holding a flag, and he's standing in front of a tank, right?
Yeah.
That is masterful propaganda, right? Because that tank is supposed to represent a socialist or a communist state. And it's not people, it's not anyone with feelings, it's just this cold, mechanical piece of machinery. And then the individual standing in front of it is an individual, right? One lone person, not a crowd of protesters, not even a flag representing a movement or a political party, just one lone guy, right? And it's, imperialism was saying to the world, we are for the individual, and the governments that we are toppling, they don't help people, they don't feed people, they're just these cold, mechanical pieces of machinery. You want to talk about effective propaganda? That is really, really effective propaganda. And it's a gross distortion of what actually happened in Tiananmen Square and what was happening all throughout Eastern Europe. I mean, you can get into the facts. But you want to talk about effective propaganda, man. Like, Joseph Goebbels would be very, very impressed.
Oh, it was. I mean, they pulled that off masterfully. That was very well done. Even when decades later they admitted they lied.
Well, right. I mean, we have WikiLeaks. That was like one of the latest. WikiLeaks showed the article by the Chilean diplomats, but before WikiLeaks said it, you had the BBC reporter who was on the scene. You had Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times who was on the scene.
Oh, God.
Multiple people came forward and said that there was not a massacre in Tiananmen Square. Right, that the students had been there for a couple months, they'd been protesting, and then the city was put under martial law, and then the students agreed to peacefully disperse, and then for the next, few days, there was an armed battle all over the capital city, right? And that there were people with guns, and there were hundreds of Chinese soldiers that were killed, and there were snipers on rooftops, and different sections of the People's Liberation Army fighting each other, and that it was a big incident in which a lot of people were killed on both sides after the square was peacefully dispersed, right? And it was a horrendous incident, and a lot of people lost their lives, people who shouldn't have died. And I mean, we're not saying that it wasn't a big tragedy what happened, but this narrative that they were just peacefully protesting in the square and then China just, rolled over them all with tanks. I mean, that's not what happened. I mean, and we have Nicholas Kristof to confirm that. We've got WikiLeaks and the Chilean diplomats to confirm that. We've got, Robert Miles of the BBC to confirm that. I mean, eyewitnesses say that's not what happened, but that's the narrative that gets repeated in Western media, despite the fact it's widely been refuted. But even what's even weirder about that incident is that the protest in Tiananmen Square, it was called democracy, right? That's what they wanted, democracy, right? And this is how it always happens in every color revolution, because that's one word, democracy. The word democracy is in the Chinese constitution like hundreds of times, right? Like Mao called his redistribution campaign New Democracy, right? So just saying you want democracy doesn't mean you want the Western system, right? That's not what that necessarily means, right? And what was very weird is that that there were protests all throughout China in the lead up to the Tiananmen Square thing in 1989. All throughout the country, there were protests against the presence of black students because China had a scholarship program for African students to come to China. And there were protests all across the country lynching these black students and saying that this was a waste of Chinese money to help these Africans get an education. So that was a big issue. This demand, these students didn't want black students on the campuses. So it was like a racist demand. Plus, there were actually a lot of Maoists in Tiananmen Square. There were a lot of people that didn't like Deng Xiaoping and wanted to go back to the Gang of Four and the Mao era, right? People who worked in state-run industries were out there protesting. And there's actually quotes of people who were in Tiananmen Square and said there were more pictures of Mao in Tiananmen Square than there had ever been since the Cultural Revolution, right? And there were other people there. There were religious groups that were out there. It was everybody in the world. It was like the memo went out, time to go. If you have any grievance whatsoever, if you're frustrated by anything in society, go to Tiananmen Square and protest. And so they all did. But Western media made it look like, oh, all these people want American capitalism. That's what they want. And that it wasn't that. There was so many different causes, and color revolutions are like that, mind you. The Arab Spring, for example, what was that about? Freedom? What was it about? I mean, what was it for? Who was the leader of the Arab Spring? What was the demand? Well, there's always an agenda. When you see a mass outpouring like that, and there's no clear agenda, there is somebody with an agenda behind the scenes, but that agenda is not up front.
When the agenda is not up front, then you got to really question it.
Yeah, and a lot of people, I think there probably were people in China that had legitimate concerns or frustrations that got manipulated during that whole event. And that's how it always happens. I know a lot of people in Syria, for example, right? Who they were very excited about the Arab Spring when it was starting, because there is a lot of corruption in Syria. There are a lot of problems. So they went out and protested. But then when the civil war started and it became a question of, do you want the secular bought socialist government, or do you want Wahhabi extremists who cut people's heads off and want to create a caliphate and want to slaughter all the Christians and slaughter all the Alawites? It was pretty obvious what side they were on. But at the beginning, it just seemed like a general outpouring of frustration. And that happens. A lot of times, Brzezinski and others figured out how they could kind of manipulate people to kind of weave their legitimate grievances into a bigger agenda.
Yeah.
But it's all worth observing, it's like we live in very, very strange times. During the Cold War, the way it was presented is it was like, it was about communism was trying to take over the world, and the USA just didn't want communism to take over the world. So they had Franco, he was a fascist in Spain. They had European social democrats. They had, American capitalism, but it was like they were all just against communism. But we're in this weird postmodern world where ideologically, the role that was once played by communists is now being played by capitalism. It's the Western, Wall Street, neoliberal, global free market economy against the world, right? And they don't care if you're a Ba'ath socialist. They don't care if you're an Islamic revolutionary like in Iran. They don't care if you're a Christian nationalist like the government of Russia. They don't care if you're a Bolivarian like in Venezuela. But it's like their system is on the offensive. Their system is trying to take over the whole world, right? And destroy any alternative to it. They're the new Trotskyites with their permanent revolution. They're having a permanent capitalist revolution all over the world.
That's an interesting point.
Yeah, that's the era that we're living in, and that most of the opposition now to U.S. imperialism isn't based on we're trying to build communism or we're trying to build some heaven on earth. It's just kind of, we don't want this, we don't want what was done to Libya. We don't want what's been done to Syria, what's been done to Iraq and Afghanistan. We don't want, the kind of the economic demolition that's been done to Haiti. We just don't want that to come to our country. That's really what the forces opposing U.S. imperialism around the world are saying. They're just saying, we don't want you to bring your system to our country. We want to put up a wall and say, stay out. We want to keep building up our economy. We want our economy to be organized to serve public good and not to serve the profits of the Wall Street billionaires. But it's not an ideological revolution. It's not like the capitalists are the ones on the offensive, and all kinds of forces around the world are just saying no to them.
Yeah, it's a self-determination movement.
Essentially, and I think it's more about economics than anything else.
Well, yeah, I mean, the freedom to develop your own country the way you choose to do so.
Right, and ultimately, though, in order to do that, you can't have a free market system, because if you have a free market system, the U.S. imperialists are going to win, and hands down, because they have, they've cornered the market. They've cornered the global market on oil, on steel manufacturing, on everything, right? I mean, they run the world market, so if you're just going to deregulate everything, they're going to win, right? So ultimately, in order to have your country develop, you have to take control of it. It's fascinating stuff, and it's I almost wonder what all these great revolutionaries of the 20th century would say if they were alive today. I feel like their heads would be spinning, but they would have some insights, that would be very, very useful to those of us who want to challenge this kind of power, because I feel like the world has changed so much.
Yeah, it definitely has. You still got more time, or been more than 15 minutes?
Jason, I want to just tell you, I don't always agree with everything you say, but keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah, same to you.
Yeah, the fact that so many people are tuning into your videos, having conversations about Marxist ideas, debating them, going back and forth, agreeing with you, disagreeing with you, that's a beautiful thing. What you're doing, no one else is doing that, by the way. I mean, you are doing something unprecedented, and I'm glad you're doing it, And I'm glad you're brave enough to keep doing it in the face of people that are being crazy out there, you know what I mean? I really admire you for your persistence, the fact that you've kept doing this. And how many years have you been making these videos, may I ask?
It is over 9.5.
9.5 years you've been going. Wow.
If I had been an actual journalist, I'd be a veteran by now.
Well, there you go. Well, keep up the good work. And thanks for having me on to have a chat, on this lovely Wednesday afternoon. It's really hot here in New York City. It's one of the hottest days, I'll tell you, the sun is just beating down on me here. I'm standing out on the street of New York having a conversation. I hope there's not too much background noise.
No, it's okay. It's actually pretty hot here. I'm in the wine growing region of Niagara, so.
Oh, nice. Well, have a drink in my honor.
Well, here's to us being white and having a tremendous conversation.
Well, there you go. Thanks, Jason. Have a good evening.
See ya.
Yep.